Hello and welcome to Vincent Codes Finance. In this video, I'll show you how to install Python 3.12 on macOS with Poetry and VSCode using Homebrew. By the end of this video, you should have a fully working Python environment ready to do some coding and some data analysis. So in order to install Python, you'll need three things. First, you'll need Python the interpreter. This is the program that's actually going to execute your code. Second, we'll need a package manager, and for us that's going to be Poetry. Package manager is the program that lets you decide and handle and manage all the libraries that you need for a given project. And finally, we'll need an editor, and for that we'll use VSCode or Visual Studio Code, an editor by Microsoft that's now one of the most widely used editor for Python. In order to install all of these, we could just go on their respective website, download the official installers, and install all the software. Although it can be quite complicated, especially for Python and Poetry. Instead, what we'll do is we'll use Homebrew, which is the missing package manager for macOS. What Homebrew does is it lets you install applications from the command line. Don't be afraid, you'll need to use the terminal, but that's okay, it's actually going to turn out to be much easier. And by the way, Homebrew and Poetry is not the only way to manage your dependency and your installation for Python. Up until last year, I was actually using another distribution to install my Python called Anaconda, which you may have heard of. However, now I feel that Poetry and Brew is the way to go for managing your installation. So if we compare what they have in terms of differences, Brew and Poetry have tons of advantages. First and foremost, you get more flexibility in the Python version that you want to use, which means that you can easily start a project with a given version of Python and keep it, or update your version of Python easily. Whereas with Anaconda, you could always choose the version of Python that you wanted to use once you started a project, but changing it afterwards always tended to be more work than necessary. Second, Poetry is really good for dependency management, which is especially important if you want to make sure that all your collaborators use the same versions of each library so that the code that you write also runs on their computer. Third, Poetry has really good performance, meaning that you can easily set up all your dependencies in a flash. Whereas with Anaconda, it's always a bit more tedious creating a new environment, and the time it takes to install all your dependencies is also much longer. And finally, with Poetry, I found that it's always simple to update, whether it's update Poetry or Python or update all the dependencies in your project. Whereas with Anaconda, it's always possible to update your dependencies. It's actually fairly easy until you run into issues or conflicts and things like that, and then things can get really messy. On the downside, Homebrew and Poetry tend to have a more complicated initial setup, and that's what I'm trying to kind of ease you in today with this video, so that you actually can get a working setup without too much trouble. Then there's also the issue of having a new learning curve. Like any new tool, Poetry will have a slight, although not that hard, learning curve, whereas if you already know Anaconda, then that's not an issue. And also finally, it's not as widely used yet as Anaconda because it's much newer, although it is gaining in popularity really quickly. As for Anaconda, one of the things that made it really popular from the start was its ease of use. And also, we've got to consider that there is a wide adoption of Anaconda in science and data analysis, which means that there's a lot of resources using Anaconda and discussing and helping you solve any issue you might encounter. However, the negatives are quite important in my mind. One of them is bloat and performance. Anaconda tends to be slow. Creating new environments take forever. Then there's the issue of updating, which actually is not too bad with Anaconda. It is easy to update packages until you run into any issue. Then, if there are conflicts, dependencies that don't work together anymore and things like that, resolving issues can be really complex, and most of the time the only solution is just to create a new environment and restart from scratch. And because it takes a while, it's always a pain. Another big difference to note between the two is that when you install Python with Homebrew, actually Brew will install Python as a managed environment, which means that your environment will be locked. What that means is that you won't be able to install any package in your base environment as you would in Anaconda or with a default Python installation. I actually don't think that's a bad idea. The main benefit of locking your main Python environment is that it won't become bloated and it won't become stuck, not being able to update it because of conflicts and things like that. That has happened to me in the past with Anaconda. And in those situations, I actually had to fully reinstall Anaconda, and that was a pain. It is always possible to disable this option, but I would suggest that you keep it. What I do, because I like to have an environment that's always ready to, say, open a file or do something quickly, is I create for myself a Sandbox environment. So a separate environment where I have all my kind of default packages that I like to have open. So towards the end of this video, we'll actually create a Sandbox environment where we'll have pandas and all the different packages that I like to have around. With that covered, now I think we're ready to proceed to the installation. So to proceed with the installation today, we'll first need to install Homebrew, which is the package manager that we'll use to install everything else. Then once that's installed, we'll install Python, Poetry, and VSCode. And finally, I'll install also two more tools that I find useful to have around. So we'll install Git and the companion apps for GitHub, which are also useful for dealing with code because they basically let you track changes with your code and collaborate with others in an efficient manner. So we'll start by installing Homebrew. And to install Homebrew, we'll have to go into the terminal. You actually have the terminal and already installed on your computer. It comes with every Mac. You can find it in application under utilities, or you can use Spotlight. So command space, and then you just type terminal and enter. It should take you to something that looks kind of like this. Although I won't use the base terminal, I have my favorite terminal, which is iTerm2 that I've already have set up. It looks a bit nicer, but it's actually, in effect, it's going to lead to the same thing. It's just going to be a bit prettier for this video. So once you're in the terminal, you can install Homebrew. But before we can install Homebrew, there's one more dependency that Homebrew requires, which is the xcode command line tool. So xcode, it's Apple development environment to code Mac apps or iPhone apps and so forth. So it's not for Pythons, but the command line tools are really useful. They're kind of useful for every programmer, and they're actually required by Brew. So if you don't have them already installed, you can install them directly in the terminal with the command xcode-select --install. Enter, and then it will install. So for me, they're already installed, so it won't reinstall them again, but that's how you would install them. Once you've got that, then you can proceed and install Brew. Brew is fairly easy to install, although the command is quite complex. So you can go on their website, so brew.sh, and their installation command is there. You just copy it directly from the website and paste it in the terminal. So once you paste it in the terminal, it's going to execute the installation script. It's first going to ask you for your admin password so that you can install Brew to manage apps on your computer. Once you've got that, it's going to tell you what it's going to install, and then it's going to install it for you. And one thing you'll have to check towards the end, once that everything is installed, is the output. So Brew is going to tell you what's been installed. You're looking for the installation successful message, but there might also be here a message to ask you to add Brew to your path with a command. So it's not there for me because I've already installed Brew in my path, but if you get that message that you should do it, then just copy the command that Brew tells you and paste it back into the terminal and execute that command. That's going to add Brew to your path. So once you've done that, now you've got everything set up. We can check that Brew is really well installed by doing brew ---- version. Should show us the version. Now that that's done, we're ready to install our software. Installing our software, fairly easy. So to install Python, all we'll have to do is type brew install Python. But we want specific versions, so we'll install Python 3.12. So we'll install Python 3.12, and I also like to keep older versions around, so we'll install the previous two versions as well. So Python 3.11 and Python 3.10, all within the same command. So all you have to do is add Python 3.11 and Python 3.10 there. We'll proceed with the install. So they're already installed on my computer, so Brew might not want to reinstall them, although it seems like I've got one that's slightly out of date. So I had 3.11.6.1, so it's been installing 3.11.7 for me. For you, it will install all the new versions, and once that's done, we can check that they are installed. Now, Brew doesn't always link to the latest version. So if I can check the version that's been installed as the default version on my computer, it is 3.12. That might not be the case on yours. I think by default, Brew still, as of today, sets 3.11 as the default. I did change it on my computer. So having Python 3.12 as the default Python, what that means is that if I type Python, this is the Python that will open. To close it, you can do exit, then open and close parentheses. Now, if you wanted to open another version, you could just do Python 3.11, enter, and that would open that actual version. If your default version is not 3.12, but 3.11, and you'd like it to be 3.12, what you need to do is you need to add to your path the Python 3.12 installation. In order to do that, what you need to do is to add that specific command to that file that's called .zshrc. So one way to do it is to execute this command. I won't spell it out, but it is in the description, on the video description, so you can copy it there. And what it does is that it adds the path for this Python 3.12 library to your path. So I won't execute this command on my computer because I already have this version in my file, so I don't want to add this line in extra time, but this is the way to make sure that you get this version set up for you. Once we have that out of the way, we're ready to install Poetry, and you guessed it, Poetry is going to be fairly easy to install as well. All we have to do is type brew install Poetry, enter, and then Poetry is going to get installed automatically. Once Poetry is installed, we can actually check that it is installed and check the version that's installed by doing Poetry -- version. But one thing that I also like to change from the default Poetry installed is where the virtual environments actually get installed. By default, Poetry will create new environments and install them in a hidden directory. However, I don't find this ideal. I prefer to have these virtual environments installed in the project directory for each project. That way, when I'm done with a project and I want to remove the project from my computer, I can just delete this environment as well. And like for me, I don't like having things hidden. Fortunately, it's easy to change. All you have to do is change Poetry's configuration. And in order to do that, you can type Poetry config. Then the configuration name is going to be virtualenv.in-project, and you set that to true. And that's all there is to it. And once we've got that done, there's one thing left to do to have our Python environment working, which is to install VSCode. And how do we install VSCode? Well, you guessed it, with Brew. However, there is one slight difference, because in Brew, there's two types of applications, and these applications get installed differently. So they are command line application like Python and Poetry, and these are installed with formulas, just like we did right now. And on Mac, there are also kind of what we consider kind of full-featured application, but actually the applications that go in your applications folder, so those which would have kind of graphical interface and so forth, and those are installed with casks. So in order to install Visual Studio Code, what you'll need to do is still brew install, but you'll have to use the --cask option, and then the package name, which is Visual-Studio-Code. And then voila, now you've got VS Code installed on your computer. And finally, there's two more things that I wanted to install today, Git and GitHub. Git is a version control system which lets you track changes to your code. It's really, really convenient, especially when you want to do reproducible and traceable research. And then there's GitHub, which is a server that hosts Git repositories. So it lets you sync your code with your co-authors or with yourself among different computers. And it also provides a lot of features that facilitate collaboration. So it is quite popular with coders. And for that, we'll need to install Git and the GitHub tools. So Git, we actually already installed it because it comes with the Xcode tools. But just to be sure that we have the latest version, we'll install it again with Brew. So in order to install it with Brew, what we need to do is just Brew install Git. And then if we want to install the GitHub command line tools, the command is brew install gh for GitHub. And finally, another useful tool is GitHub Desktop, which is an app with a graphical user interface to GitHub. And for that one, because it is a kind of full-featured app, we'll have to use brew install --cask and then GitHub. And once that's done, now you have installed everything. So we've got two more things left to do today. First, we'll use Poetry to create our Sandbox environment, in which we'll install Python packages that we want to have on hand whenever we need to test something or open a file or just do something quick. And then we'll also need to configure Visual Studio Code, because VSCode, while it's great and it comes with a lot of things, is not pre-configured specifically for Python, because it can be used with a lot of different languages. So we'll just need to set it up so that it's ready to use Python. Okay, let's start with our Sandbox environment. So which libraries should we include? Well, what I like to have are mostly the basic scientific packages. So those that you'll find in a default, say, Anaconda installation. Although I do also add a few libraries that I find useful and that are not installed by default on Anaconda. Here are the libraries that I will install. So we first have Pandas, the data analysis library, got NumPy, the numerical computing library, and SciPy, the scientific computing library. Those are kind of the three basic libraries for scientific computing using Python. Then we'll install Matplotlib and Seaborn, which are two plotting libraries that are quite useful for generating nice graphs. Next, we'll install stat models, scikit-learn, and linear models to do statistic, machine learning, and econometrics. And then I'll also install PyArrow, which is a library for working with Parquet files. And I'll introduce you to Parquet files in a future video. And PyArrow also adds extra functionality to Pandas by adding a different memory backend, which is another topic that I'll cover in a future video. And finally, we'll also install Jupyter, that lets you open Jupyter Notebooks, which is one file format for Python code. And it also powers the interactive window in VS Code, which is super useful. And finally, I also install PyTest, which is a testing library that I really can't live without. So in order to create our sandbox, we'll first have to decide where it's going to go and create the directory to put it in. I've decided to put it into documents in a folder called Sandbox. So for that, I'll have to create this directory. So mkdir for make directory, the little till, which is my own directory, -documents-sandbox. Then I'll move into that directory with cd change directory into that sandbox directory. And there I'll create the environment using Poetry. So I'll use Poetry init, which is the command to create a new environment. And then I'll just accept all the default suggestions, except that I won't define the main dependencies interactively. I'll add them manually. So when that's done, Poetry shows me it has created a file that's called pyproject.toml. This pyproject.toml contains all the information about the project and the dependencies. Right now there are no dependencies, so we'll add them. For that, we'll use the Poetry command. So Poetry add, just write all the packages that we want to install. So Poetry add Pandas, NumPy, SciPy, Matplotlib, Seaborn, stats models, scikit-learn, linear models, PyArrow, Jupyter, and PyTest. So when I enter that, Poetry is going to install all of these packages and all of their dependencies as well. if we look at what's in our directory now, there's going to be one more file and one more subdirectory. We've got poetry log and the .venv directory. .venv is our environment. That's where all the packages are stored. And poetry log is the log file that describes all the exact version of my packages that have been installed. So if I share that with my collaborators, we can make sure that we're all on the exact same version of each package. And that's it. Now we have a functioning poetry environment. Lastly, we've got one more thing to do, which is to set up VSCode. VSCode is a really powerful editor that can be used for many languages, but when you install it fresh, it comes with only the bare bones. So you want to install the different features that you need for Python, and for that you need to install extension. For me, the easiest way to install a fully working environment in VS Code for Python is through profiles. Profiles is a really nice feature of VS Code. It lets you have different configuration of VS Code for different use cases. For example, have one profile when I do Python coding, have one profile when I do LaTeX file editing, and I've got profiles for other use cases. So in order to create a profile, you just click on the leftmost bottom left icon, choose profile, and then create profile. That's gonna open the box. I'll create a new profile called Python Research. Make sure to copy not from Python because that's for kind of web development. Okay? What we really want to do if you want to do data analysis, you want to start with the data science template. That's the one we'll use. And then you can select your icon. For that, I'll use a nice time series icon. Then I'll make sure that this profile lets me configure everything specifically for that use case. Once I'm ready, I'll click create and my new profile will get created, and we'll see here, because I've opened the extension tab, that a bunch of extensions were installed, including the Jupyter. And if we go down, we'll see that we also have Python and PyLens installed. So now we've got everything we need to run some Python code. We can actually test it out. We'll test it out with our Sandbox. For that, we'll open a folder, find our Sandbox and open that Sandbox. VS Code, it doesn't work directly on files, but it code works on directories. So projects must be in directories. And when you open a directory, that's what VS Code considers to be a project. Once you open a directory for the first time, it's going to ask you, do you trust the authors of the files in this folder? This is important because code can do pretty much anything on your computer. So VS Code, before it lets code do weird stuff, it wants to ask your permission first. So make sure that you only check yes on code that you actually trust. Now we've got our Sandbox open. We see, and we can test whether our Python installation works by looking at the command palette. So we can go command in VS Code can be entered to the command palette, which on Mac you can open with Command Shift P or FN F1 as well. And then once you're in the command palette, what you want to do is load up the interactive window. Just start typing interactive window. It is part of the Jupyter extension, so that's the one you'll be looking for. So if I start typing interactive, we'll see that's the second one, create interactive window. That's what we want. Open the interactive window, and we can see that it actually detected my Python environment that we created. Everything is there, and now I can just do a quick test, do 1+1, and execute it either by clicking the play button or doing Shift Enter, and then it works. Congratulations, now you've got a working Python environment and you're ready to do some coding. So thank you for watching. If you found this video useful, please like, and also consider subscribing to the channel for Python tutorials